toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. As I've said before, that can be tricky to spell, even harder to say. And it's the last chapter in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the fifth, because we're talking about the numbers of books. She said Ephesians was the 10th book, right? Anybody remember how to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, what is it? Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. What's that? Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. General Electric Phone Company was how we were taught to remember it as kids. And then I think you go into all the words that begin with T, and those are in alphabetical order as it relates to that. So anyhow, there's mnemonics for you to get there. But these first 5 books are sometimes referred to as the books of the law, or the books of the Torah, the books of the law. Sometimes people call them the books of Moses. Right? Anybody ever heard that? Because the law was written on stone tablets, given to Moses. And here's what happens. Let's read it. I want you to consider. I want you to think about several things here, because this talks about expectations, about things that have happened in Moses' life. We'll refer back to a couple of those. But it also talks about what is our responsibility as a community. And how we look at that. So let's go ahead and take a look. In chapter 34, beginning with verse 1 in Deuteronomy. It said, Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite of Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as the Dan, the Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev, and the plain that is the valley of Jericho, and the city of the palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swore to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite of Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And then Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. And so the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent to him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all the land. And for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Dun, dun, dun. That's a lot to chew on. In Sunday school today, we talked about a different scene about the burning bush. And if you have to read, and some people I think are afraid of the Old Testament because they're afraid of reading some of the names. There's a lot of begats in some areas, and then there's the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites. We said if you say those too fast, you might spit all over yourself trying to get them out. And he talks about this expanse. So they've come to the end of Moses' life, and if these books would be referred to as the books of Moses, wouldn't it seem to make sense that of all people who would get to see the promised land, it should be Moses? I mean, think about it. His life could have been snuffed out at the very beginning. There was a decree that went out that all the male children under a certain age should be put to death. They whisked him away and they put him they float him down the river. And then someone from the palace kind of pulls him and plucks him up from the river, and he's kind of raised with this sheltered existence. He doesn't quite know that he's not one of them for a while. And then an incident happens where he finds out that he is actually a Hebrew, one of the slave people. And then when he sees a taskmaster coming down hard on a gentleman, he ends up killing the guy. And he tries to hide and bury the body. It's kind of like these lies. Sometimes if you do something bad, you try to bury it long enough. All you do when you keep burying things like that is put a whole bunch of mounds out there, and we end up seeing real plainly that there's something awry. We can't bury things but so far. Right? They have a way of coming back, and the Lord of all resurrections has a way of trying to bring back to life things that perhaps we thought should be good and dead. But the glory of that is there's parts of us that may have been dead for a long time that he also brings back to life. It was a bad relationship. Maybe it was a bad work situation. Maybe it's things we're running, an event in our childhood. Who knows what it is but you and God? But he does come into those lifeless areas where we think death is knocking around, and he breathes new life into things. He resurrects hope, for he is a God of hope. This story is a very interesting one. I titled the sermon message, Passing the Torch. I thought about the Olympics. Anybody ever like the Olympics? Yeah, it's like, particularly when you say USA. Maybe you could do G-O-D. USA. I remember as a kid, the Olympics would come on, and it would just kind of rule TV. I mean, now we have like 9,000 stations. So it's not as big of a, you can find something else on. It may be an infomercial, but you can find something else on. Back then you had like 3, maybe 4. It was like, your parent throwing something at you, and you reached up and clunk, 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 clunk on the big old console Zenith. Y'all are laughing because you seem to know what I'm talking about. The earliest remote controls. Everybody's still laughing. Apparently that image really works. But the modern Olympics started in 1894 with the International Olympic Committee was formed. And then that led to the first modern games a couple of years later in 1896 in Athens, Greece. And I think the things that remind me about those events were just the diversity of the countries in our world, the diversity of peoples, but also the diversity of these like sports and athletic contests. They were like, I didn't know people raced around on an indoor track in bicycles with discs in the middle of them. Who knew? Or that the humans could do backflips and do iron crosses on rings and do things with ribbons and flip it in the air and catch them in their teeth and stuff. These people are world-class athletes. They've worked a long time to get to that, and some of them may only be like 14 years old. Michael Phelps is one of the most decorated Olympians ever, and he's been in like 4 or 5 Olympics. And you consider the expanse of that time. He probably started when he was 2, because he still looks good at the age that he is. What's important about those things is one of the things that I think about is a few weeks out, they always have a symbolic gesture of the torch going through the news. Today it's going from here to here. And there's different people, maybe former Olympians, who couldn't compete because they had served in our country and maybe were in Paralympics or something. And they carry this torch for days and till they get to a place where that night, where all these countries are being represented and they flood into this place, and that torch is finally carried in and it lights some big magnificent flame. That flame, it's symbolic. They've carried the torch. They've passed it one to the next. It's not going out. The people themselves, we may not remember all their names, but we remember that the torch continued to be passed. The Olympics also teach us about other things like running, which although I would do like away from something, I had to have more purposeful running, like, hey, there was a refrigerator, let me run to that, or there was a picnic, let me run to that. I kind of liked basketball and other things because it's like, hey, I get to run with this ball, and having to bounce it distracted me from the actual idea that I was running. But there's these relay races. And what do they have to do to be able to go? Hey, we'll use my illustration of so they're running. And they come up, and if you're running the first leg of the race, you have to do pass the baton. All right, so let's talk about that for a minute. Do I just run up to somebody and say, "Urch"? There you go. Does that work? It's not very fast. That's not going to get us further down the road, is it? So what happens as we run? Jeff's going to be my sermon illustrator. As we run, he's going to have a certain hand, and I'm going to reach back, and I'm going to run with him the first few steps. And he keeps, and until it's handed off to the next person. Thank you, Jeff. No coercion on that. I just put him on the spot. So what happens in our lives a lot of times, I think this is what we've been doing. This is what I've been called to do. I've been called to run the race of life and to do these things. And some of these things we do better than others. I'm not your mathematician. I can balance a checkbook if Mariana lets me, which isn't often. And I can do a few basic things that way. You don't want me to be your quantum physicist. You don't want me to be your if I know that I'm not good at. But there's always going to be somebody else coming whom God has called, whom God is sending. And how well do we do that hand? Do we do it like a hot potato and say, well, I've served my time, that's great. Let me just pitch it to you. And if you've served on nominating committee can know how difficult that could be too, right? Sometimes somebody's like, great, that was hard work. Let me pass it off to somebody else. But sometimes we have to be willing to take a few steps in the journey along with somebody else to be able to hand off well and to do well. There's lots of little nuances for that thought process. So what's happening here? This is a time of transition. We'll talk more about why he can get to go in a minute. But this is a time of transition. It's coming to the end of Moses' life. And he's not allowed to go in. Does anybody know why he's not allowed to go in? He disobeyed God. Well, interestingly enough, I kind of like that thought, but that would seem to be more of a legit reason for him not to go in. He took his staff and he hit a rock twice. What? He hit a rock twice. Actually, he had hit it a time before because God instructed him that time to take his staff and touch the rock. And out of the rock came water into the desert. It was their source of life and strength. Here's the thing. God instructed him what to do, and the next time God said, don't let the staff be the instrument. You teach people to pray and to ask that water come out of this. Moses steps up as kind of like he's the judge of the people, and he says, why are you grumbling? We're going to take care of this. And he hits the rock twice and water comes out. God still provided through the people, but the messenger was very disobedient and seemed to claim that the effort and the work came from him and through him rather than from Almighty God, who is the only one that could do that. Let's talk about a rock. Is a rock important? Some of you might think rock and roll is important, right? But is a rock important? Because they talked about a wise and a foolish builder at one time in the Bible, and one of them builds their house on a sure foundation of rock, and one of them builds on sand. Well, when the winds and waves come, which one's going to hold up better? One on the rock. Rock. A rock was always a symbol of who Christ was. The stone builders rejected becomes the cornerstone and the capstone. It is Christ. We talked about it before, and it says, upon this rock that the foundation of everything is laid. Those who try to think they can bear the weight of it get crushed by it. Those who stumble and fall over will be busted to pieces. It's actually the truth of God in Christ. Christ is the rock. And then when Peter comes, they say, who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, good job, Simon. I'm going to now call you Little Rock. Peter. For upon that foundation, I'm going to build my church. Water. Back these pretty ladies here is a cross, and there's a cavernous area back there. Anybody been in it before? Specifically that one? Water is a symbol of salvation. I've got peace like a river because God's salvation is rolling over me, and it's bringing the presence of God and the salvation of God from the surest thing ever, God's Son, Jesus Christ. When we become like him, we become like Peter, these smaller rocks, and together we make a foundation rock all throughout the New and the Old Testament. So they come through, and as they gather up 12 stones as they come across the last time and head toward the promised land. Think about the 12 disciples being the 12 stones. Think about raising an Ebenezer, which was just a stack of stones that represented a place where God was at and his glory resided. So what does it happen when the little rocks of the world come together? We become a visible force for Christ in the world today, and it's extremely important that we don't point to our glory, but to the rock, which brings salvation and hope and peace. Moses tried to force God's hand, and he wanted to do it his way, and he was upset and frustrated with the people. It wasn't a righteous indignation, it was his indignation. And being indignant caused a much deeper issue for himself. If you're looking for that, it's found in Numbers chapter 20. You can read more about that scene and incidents. But it was not trusting God and not worshiping God in the proper way by being obedient. This was God's chosen messenger, and he did what he shouldn't. And there's several places throughout these books that talk about it. But he does tell him something else. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll let you go and be able to see the land which I'm sending the people. Can you imagine? He finds out that he is not who he thought he was. He kills a man. He runs away. And then he meets this girl and he marries her, and he's working for his father-in-law, but then he's going to end up working for his father before it's all over with. He has this instance at the burning bush. He's come a long way. By this time, he's not a young feller anymore, as we say. And then they get out, and the people are disobedient first, and then God says, well, we're going to let a couple generations pass before you go in. He delivered them out of captivity, but hadn't yet brought them to the promised land. They were in a place of the wilderness. And Moses takes them around for 40 years. I just said I had a birthday a few days ago. I was 42. An 80-year-old man was traipsing around with people in the desert for 40 years because they were disobedient. I don't think I'd do anything to compound that for myself. But there's something else about this story that's fascinating and wonderful. He takes him up there and he lets him see. He says, I've let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. But throughout the rest of the Bible, there's places where Moses makes appearances again. Maybe the place that he inherited was much better than a land flowing with milk and honey. Maybe when he closed his eyes in this place, he woke up to a new vision of what a promised place could look like, with a promised person, with the Savior that he had rejected. And part of the commentary that talks about this rock being smashed twice would be like when he asked him the first time to strike it to bring forth water. It was like him nailing Christ to the cross and bringing about salvation. When he turned around and violently struck it 2 more times because he was mad at the people, it was like crucifying Christ all over again. That's harsh. Didn't just exist in this earthly plane. He existed a long time before he became flesh and made his dwelling among us. What things do we do for the Lord? His eyes were able to see, but he was not able to go. I don't know where God is going to lead us in every part of our lives, but I believe God is seeking to have us be a people that dream, that have visions, that look a future and a hope. And in some ways, we're part and parcel of that, but we may not see the full fruition of that, right? I may not see the full fruition of that in my lifetime. I don't know the day or the hour that the Lord's coming back, but I do know He's promised. And what He's asked me to do is to be faithful in the time that I've had, to journey as well as I can, to be a person who talks about what that place looks like as the Lord gives me direction and gives me strength, but to also to participate in it with you. In some ways, Moses, as their leader, maybe saw himself as being different and apart, and he could do different than the people. But God said, you're all together in this. So where are we going? What does it mean to be the church of Jesus today? Will we do things that defame His name, that crucify Him over and over again, that dilute down the powerful streams and dam up the powerful streams of salvation that God is trying to offer? Or will we say, let's move forward. Let's move on. Let's say, even if I the last line of hope is, I'm going to participate in the process because we are all going together. What do we do? Moses, it says, was a servant of the Lord, and he died there in the land of Moab. And he, God, buries him in the valley in the land of Moab opposite of Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. This perhaps is part of the conclusion that I'm hoping Moses himself didn't have to write. If you believe that he wrote all these books, by the way, you're going to show you this, you're going to write it down, and then you're going to die, and I'm going to bury you someplace, and nobody will know where you've been buried. And go ahead and write that down, and then we'll get on with the. So I'm prayerfully hopeful that that part perhaps was authored by an associate. Nonetheless, it was the word of the Lord. The Lord took care of him. He buried him. He made sure that he had a place, but he also made sure that people could not worship Moses, but they would have to worship God alone, because there's not a place they can go back to, like people keep saying they have the shin bone of, the mother of Jesus, or, the bones of St. John, and they're in this chapel here in Europe or wherever. It's not about those people. It's never been about those people. So he made it clear that I'm going to take care of Moses and put him in a place where he can be honored and dignified by his burial, but he will not be something that can be worshipped. For God alone is worthy of worship. It says he's 120 years old, and his eye was undimmed, and his vigor was unabated. Sometimes have to wear readers. Yay? Hey. Some of you may be wearing contacts. Some of you may be wearing glasses. Some of us know as time goes on, things change, right? We don't see as well as perhaps we once did. I find it interesting that at 120 years old, it said that his vision was not dimmed. His vigor had not gone out. He was still full of life, full of hope, full of purpose. And I don't believe it's because he was worried about what came at the end of his life, but because he always saw pursue that. There's not a retirement age for Christians. Heaven's not a retirement village in the sky. It's a place where we continue the work we've done here, which is to faithfully worship the Creator of all the universe for all eternity. God took him out. When God took him home, he still had fight left in him. Don't get to a place where we say, I've done all I can do for the Lord. Say, I've been given a day. What more can I do for the Lord? I've been given this life. What more can I do with it? How can I trust God in that process? And then how can I pass the torch of the baton? I was thinking about in the book of Samuel, where Samuel was young and he was dedicated, and Hannah was his mother, and she didn't have any children. She prayed, could I have a child? I'll dedicate him to the Lord. And Eli's sons were awful, and they were not good examples of what it was to be in service to the Lord. And so he began to raise Samuel there in the temple, and he's sleeping, but the light of the Lord had not yet gone out. And then God speaks. Light's a powerful image too. And a couple different times, Samuel goes and says, hey, by the way, did you call me? And Eli says, no, I didn't. And finally, the old priest gets it and says, next time say speak, for your servant is listening. There's a place where we have to pass the torch. Which doesn't mean we come and drop it like a hot grenade in somebody's lap. We're not playing hot potato or that little game catchphrase where you pass the little disc around and try not to get stuck when the timer goes off. But what we do is say, how can we run as faithfully our part of it? And where appropriate and when appropriate, begin to say, let me journey with you these steps that I have left until I can completely let go. Because the torch and the baton doesn't get passed if I'm also not willing to let go of some things to be able to continue in other areas where God has called me to be. Us to be. What things do we hold on to too tightly? What things do we need to bless and encourage others as they come along? Because that's really what the tradition of the church is about. It's about as we go that generations, I commend your works one generation to the next. We need you. We need you, whether you're 90, 95, or 9. We need you. And we need to together be working to see how can we share Christ with one another, help us to grow in faith and in love and compassion, and to see that even if we don't get to see whatever the promised land is in this place, that you've prepared a land that's better than a land with milk and honey, a place that's prepared for us that you'll bring us home to. His eyes were not dim because his vision was always on God. And then his passing of the torch was after the appropriate time of morning. Joshua, the son of Nun, had had his hands placed on him by Moses. Remember, he was one of the 12 spies that went out. And only Joshua and Caleb came back and said, we can take this land because God has promised it. Not because there aren't giants in the land, not because there aren't other things, but because you promised it. And the others' disobedience led them to spend 40 years in the desert. I don't think it's any mistake that God kept those two guys around to lead the next part of the progression into the city. Your eyes should not be dimmed by the things around. Look longingly ahead to what Christ has prepared for us. Today and always, can we be the people of God who serves God? It's repeated both in the New Testament, from the Old Testament in Joel. It says that there will come a time where there'll be dreams and visions. Old and young, dreams and visions.